Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2022 public lecture at Wrexham Glyndŵr University with the theme Rose West, Taking the Stand and the Judgment of Credibility. It's an absolutely fascinating title and I can't wait. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is going to be a really exciting trip through the history and the annals of a particular case in criminal justice, which many of us, I'm sure all of us, probably still remember. And I wasn't in the UK at the time, but it was being reported throughout the whole of Europe. It's such a famous case, and I can't wait to find out more about the actual background and analysing what was going on from a different perspective, which I believe is what we're going to hear about. So Dr. Caroline Gorden is a lecturer, a reader at the university in the criminology and criminal justice area, which is a really strong area within the university. It's going from strength to strength. It's publishing, it's developing policy papers. We've got Welsh government, Scottish government listening to what the department has to say. And we also made a really strong submission under the Research Excellence Framework this year from that particular field. So Caroline is clearly one of the key people in the department, and she is going to share her insights with us here tonight. Before I hand over to Caroline, I'd like to extend a special welcome to the North Wales Police Crime Commissioner, Andrew, who is here with us this evening. Been in post for about 12 months and hasn't had too many chances to be out and about, but certainly that is ramping up, and we're very pleased to have you here this evening, and we're very pleased to have so many colleagues here, students and friends and stakeholders, including members of our Board of Governors. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Caroline.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining me this evening and for taking such an interest in my work. The first thing that I want to say is that this lecture derives from an undergraduate module that I teach here at Wrexham Glyndŵr University on the criminology programme, and it's called Constructing Guilt and Innocence. Now, I noticed that I have got some Year 2 students here who I teach research methods to. That module is just coming to an end, and it bodes well because that has been a tough module. So if I've got research methods module students here, that is a really, really good thing. But more recently, my colleague, Professor Chris Birkbeck, and I turned the module into a book. And both the module and the book cover the same 11 famous trials that have attracted worldwide attention because they were fraught with disputes about the defendant's guilt or innocence. Now, in other words, in the court of public opinion, there have been endless arguments and debates about the rightness of the defendant's conviction or acquittal. Now, when it comes to criminal trials, when the evidence is weak or unclear, then a case can actually be made for the defendant's conviction or their acquittal. And that leads us to a really interesting question about the nature of truth. If a case can be made for a defendant's conviction or their acquittal, then what is the true version of what happened? What is the correct version? And importantly, how do we decide what is that correct version of what happened? So you might be sitting here and wondering, well, why are we talking about the case of Rose West then? For those of you who are old enough to remember, anyone who's old enough to remember the Rose West case? Yeah, I certainly am. She was convicted of 10 murders in 1995. And you might be thinking, well, actually, Caro, I don't remember there being any disputes about her conviction, and that you don't recall anybody arguing over the outcome of the trial. She was found guilty. But what's really interesting about the Rose West case is that there were disputes. There were significant problems for the prosecution in constructing a case against Rose. And I want to be absolutely clear here that I do not in any way advocate for Rose West's innocence any more than I do for her guilt. I'm simply interested in why she was convicted. And if a case can be made for either Rose West's guilt or innocence, then asking why she was convicted is actually a really important question to ask. And that's the question that we are going to explore this evening. So hopefully this works. No. Wrong arrow, Caro, wrong arrow. Okay, this is something that I always do with my Year 3 students. As I mentioned, this is a Year 3 module. I've been teaching constructing guilt and innocence now for the last 8 years, and I always anticipate that there might be some emotional reactions. But to say you have come here today knowing that we are going to be talking about Rose West, pictured here with her husband Fred West. And there are no two ways about it. It is a truly horrible story. And so it is important for me to emphasise a health warning in that it is quite possible that some of you will find that what I say is sensitive or disturbing. It's happened to me. That said, I will not go into any specific detail about the murders themselves, except to say that for most of the victims, it was evident that they had been tortured, sexually assaulted and dismembered. Now, it's important for me to tell you that because it becomes a key part of how the prosecution constructed the case against Rose West. Okay, so I do need to tell you that. Now, I know that most of you know about this case, but just as a reminder, because it does get very confusing with how many people are involved in this case. But just as a reminder, the couple here were charged with several murders that occurred in the 1970s and the 1980s. And for those of you who don't know, Fred West died by suicide before the trial began, leaving Rose to face the 10 murder charges alone, and she was subsequently convicted of all 10 of the murders in 1995. Now, I want to quote one of the observers of the Rose West trial, who said that the bones of these young women, silent for so many years, once discovered, were suddenly ferociously eloquent. As Mr. Leveson for the prosecution said in his opening address to the court, the victims told a story more terrible than words can express. Now, the story that I'm going to tell you about this evening centres on this house here. For those of you who are familiar with the case, or even maybe not so familiar, would have heard of the address 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. And this house sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about for the next hour. Now, in anticipation of what you might be curious about, because I know what my students are curious about, having taught it for this particular lecture for the last 8 years, often students will ask me, what was the inside of the house like? So I've anticipated that curiosity and I've decided to keep that slide in. So this is Fred and Rose's kitchen. Now, the ordinariness of this kitchen represents a really important point, that if you really think about it, you and I have far more in common with Fred and Rose West than not. But any similarities that we may have with them end right there when I want you to focus right now your gaze through that kitchen and through the back doors, those back doors into the paved garden. Just focus your gaze on that for a moment. And you are looking at a graveyard of victims who met the most horrible deaths that you could possibly imagine. The next photograph that I have is of the basement, which in itself looks somewhat more sinister, doesn't it? And you would be absolutely right. Under that floor are buried 5 bodies of the victims, who were buried in a clockwise direction according to the order of their murder. Once that graveyard, if you like, was filled up, Fred West cemented it and he turned it into a bedroom for some of the West children to sleep in. Because it gets confusing, I always like to say to my students, just as a reminder, that the victims were murdered during the 1970s and 80s, but they were not discovered until 1994. And that's in anticipation of people, of my audience, sitting there and thinking, OK, when were the bodies discovered and when were they actually murdered? So I like to reiterate it. Now, this is an interesting photograph because what happened in 1996 is that 25 Cromwell Street was in fact demolished along with its neighbouring house number 23. And what you can see there is what replaces the house is a walkway into Gloucester city centre. So how did Fred and Rose West come to the attention of the police? So it came about actually in 1992 when Fred and Rose West came to the attention of the police because of child abuse reports from one of their children, Louise. And what happened, and I'll tell you a little bit about their children in a moment, the youngest 5 children out of the 9 who lived in the West household were immediately taken into care, never to return to 25 Cromwell Street after that allegation by Louise had been made. And the police immediately became suspicious about the whereabouts of Fred and Rose's 16-year-old daughter, pictured here, Heather West. It set into motion a series of events that basically led to the police digging under the garden patio where they found Heather's body. And it came about because some of the younger children were saying, Dad always used to say to us, if you don't do as you're told, you'll end up under the patio just like Heather. And that's how it set into motion these series of events. And sure enough, they did find a body, and the pathologist came back to the detective and said, yes, we have found a body under the patio, and either this body has 3 legs or there are more bodies. Subsequently, another 8 bodies were found. Now, again, because it gets confusing, just to remind you that what I mentioned is that Rose West was convicted of 10 murders. Now, 9 of the bodies were found at 25 Cromwell Street, and 1 other body was found at a previous flat of theirs. Now, when every once in a while a famous trial comes along, there can be a tendency, and there is a tendency, for us criminologists to focus on the accused person or people. And I therefore want to tell you something about each of the victims and give you some of the very limited information I have on each of them. So the first victim that we know of is 8-year-old Charmaine, who was murdered in 1971. Now, she was the daughter of Fred West's first wife, a woman named Rena Costello, and her biological father is unknown. So Fred and Rena married, they later became separated, and one thing led to another, and Charmaine ended up in the care of both Fred and Rose, once he had obviously met Rose. So in 1994, Charmaine was found buried under the kitchen floor at Fred and Rose's previous residence, 25 Midland Road. So she was the only victim to be found outside of 25 Cromwell Street. Now, no one reported her missing because, actually, as it turned out, Fred had also murdered Charmaine's biological mother, Rena, unbeknown to everybody. Now, again, to reiterate, because I appreciate it gets confusing, the remaining 9 victims were all found at 25 Cromwell Street. So the next victim, Linda Gough, she was 19 when she was murdered in 1973. Now, she worked as a seamstress in Gloucester. She actually dated one of the lodgers. Something to say about 25 Cromwell Street was a very transient household. There were lots of lodgers coming and going. She was dating one of them. They broke up, but she remained friends with some of the other lodgers there. So it was proven, the prosecution and the defence agreed, that she was somebody who was known to 25 Cromwell Street. Now, she was found under the bathroom floor. Linda's parents did conduct their own search for her, and it actually led them back to 25 Cromwell Street, where they met Rose West. Rose West said she had to leave. She was looking after one of our children. She hit them so hard. We asked her to leave. We really don't know where she's gone. Unfortunately, because of that, because she was known to be quite rebellious, she was not officially reported as missing, and so unfortunately there was no organised search for her. Caroline Cooper was 15 when she was murdered in 1973. Now, this was a vulnerable child. She was living in care, and she disappeared after getting a bus home at a night out at the cinema with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend says that he said goodbye to her at the bus stop, and the prosecution theorised that she might have been hitchhiking. And they claimed that Fred and Rose West may have come along. She may have felt comfortable to get in the car because there was a woman in the car as well, being Rose. But whatever happened, her body was one of the bodies that was found under the basement floor. Now, her family did report Caroline missing, and extensive inquiries were made, but no trace of her was found at that time. So the next victim is 21-year-old Lucy Partington, who was murdered in 1973. She was a university student at Exeter, and she had actually returned home for Christmas. It was in a village not far from Gloucester. She'd gone to visit a friend. She decided to get the bus home after visiting her friend. And again, it's theorised by the prosecution that the Wests may have picked her up from the bus stop. She was also found under the floor of the basement. Now, Lucy's family reported her as missing. There was an extensive search that was launched. There were even television appeals, but no trace of Lucy at that time was found. Victim number 5, Teresa Siegen Thaler. She was 21 when she was murdered in 1974. She was a Swiss student. She was living and studying in London. And the circumstances of her disappearance are really quite strange in that she did decide to hitchhike from London all the way to Ireland to go and see a friend from the weekend, but she actually had no reason to pass through Gloucester. So we don't really know what happened, but whatever did happen, she found her way back to 25 Cromwell Street, and again her body was found under the floor of the basement. Now, at that time, her disappearance was reported to London's Metropolitan Police, and again, no trace of her was found at that time. So number 6, Shirley Hubbard. She was 15 when she was murdered in 1974. She was another vulnerable child. She was living in care at the time. At the time of her disappearance, she was undertaking work experience in Debenhams. And it's believed that she disappeared while travelling home from work. And again, her body was found under the basement floor. Her disappearance was reported and inquiries were made, but the police just could not pick up a trail. Juanita Mott, she was 18 when she was murdered in 1975. Now, Juanita was known to hitchhike into Gloucester at the weekends, and it was during one of those journeys that she disappeared. And again, her body was found under the basement floor. Now, again, despite the suspicious circumstances of her disappearance, in that she hadn't taken any personal possessions with her, she was due to attend a cousin's wedding the following day after her disappearance. Unfortunately, Juanita's family failed to report her as a missing person. Shirley Robinson, she was 18 when she was murdered in 1978. Now, it's agreed by everybody, the prosecution and the defence, that she was a lodger at 25 Cromwell Street, and she was in fact 8 months pregnant with Fred West's child when she was murdered. Her body and her unborn child were found buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. Unfortunately, nobody reported Shirley as missing. Alison Chambers was 17 when she was murdered in 1979. Again, she was another vulnerable child. She lived in care and she worked for a firm of solicitors. It's speculated that she was a regular visitor of 25 Cromwell Street, but again, this isn't an agreement between the prosecution and the defence. It can't be proven. But her body was found buried in the garden. Now, Alison was initially reported as missing by her mother, but her mother had received a letter. Whether it was by her or not, I don't know. But it was indicating that she was alive and well, so it was case closed. The police no longer considered her to be a vulnerable or a missing person, so it was never followed up. And then finally, Heather West, who was 16 when she was murdered in 1987. Now, she was the biological daughter of Fred and Rose West, and it is speculated that she was murdered after having an argument with both her parents. She was found buried under the garden patio. Now, no other relatives reported Heather as missing because Fred, he often changed his story, but he claimed that she had been picked up by a friend in a red car and that they had gone off to work for a holiday camp and she had got a job and that was it. But it's confusing because there are many conflicting stories among the witnesses about what Fred had actually said in terms of her disappearance. And at one point he did claim that he had reported her as a missing person. So one of the things that I always ask my students, and in actual fact, I start off often with the lecture with this picture of Rose West. It's the very famous picture. It's her mugshot, if you like. One of the things that I ask my students, and I will ask you, I won't ask you to shout anything out, don't worry, I won't pick on anybody, but I will ask you to just think very quietly to yourselves. But when you see this picture of Rose West, what words would you use to describe her? So I'll just ask you to think just quietly, and again, be reassured, I'm not going to ask anybody, but just think quietly to yourselves, what words would you use to describe Rose West when you see that mugshot of her? You all got some words in your minds? Yeah? Okay, so very typically what my students say is things like Fred West's wife. That's usually, typically the first thing that comes to mind. Evil is another word. Serial killer. Evil serial killer is another one. twisted, sex-obsessed, and sadistic. Okay, so in other words, the general public perception is that her guilt is not disputed. Her guilt is a given. When we see that picture of Rose West, that is what we tend to think of. But what if I told you that aside from the physical presence of the murder victims' bodies at the house she shared with her husband and co-accused Fred, who, by the way, took full responsibility for the murders, there was no evidence against Rose West to directly link her to the 10 murders for which she was convicted? Now, that actually may come as a surprise to you from what you've heard in the media. So Rose was what we call an alleged accomplice to the murders. In other words, an accomplice means that she took part or she knew about the murders. So she may not have wielded the murder weapon, but she was there, she took part, she knew about it. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, Fred died by suicide before the trial. And that's a problem for the prosecution, because now the main witness in the case against Rose is dead, and a good chunk of the case is gone. Now, I did say to you that Fred took full responsibility for the crimes, but all the time that Fred West is alive, he could still be questioned and potentially become a witness against Rose. And as her solicitor said, a case that was already flimsy is now flimsier than ever. It actually seemed, and I've read about 4 books when I wrote this chapter, and they all say the same thing, the writers, about this particular case. It did seem as if the charges against Rose West would be dropped because of insufficient evidence against her to warrant a trial. So the prosecution now, of course, face some major challenges in taking Rose to court over this. Bear in mind that not one of the children or the lodgers living at 25 Cromwell Street say that they had any knowledge of the crimes or the bodies in the house. So there really were no witnesses at all. So now I will talk about how the prosecution constructed a case against Rose in light of the evidential problems that they had, and why, in spite of those problems, she was convicted. Now, I want to emphasise very clearly to you again, I am not arguing for Rose West's innocence. The point is to encourage you all to think about criminal trials in a different way. So, for example, we just naturally assume that the gathering and the review of the evidence in a criminal case is literally like peeling an onion. And if you keep peeling it, you will eventually get right to the centre and the truth will be exposed. You will find the truth. In other words, we believe that the truth is something that can be found. But the point that I make in this case is that a case can be made for either her guilt or her innocence. And that is what I really mean when you hear me talking about the truth being something that is manufactured or constructed or made. We don't know what the truth is in this case. We don't. No one ever will. And the people who do, well, one of them denies all knowledge and the other one is dead. So we will see that the truth about a case can be based on how the physical evidence is interpreted by the individual person. And importantly, it can actually, surprisingly, be based on the defendant's character and how they're perceived. And in the case of Rose West, we will see how her character and her credibility or believability were interpreted and perceived by the courtroom observers. Now, I'm used to anticipating from students who will always ask me about some details of Rose West. They want to know a little bit about her background, a little bit of the familial context. Who was her family? Who were her children? So I've anticipated that curiosity from you. So again, I've left the slide in. So who is Rose West? So Rose West, as you may be interested to know, she met Fred when she was 16 years old. Fred was actually about 12 years older than her. Rose West had experienced a lifetime of abuse, mainly by her biological father, that extended to emotional, physical and sexual abuse. She was heavily involved in sex work at 25 Cromwell Street, seemingly at the request actually of Fred West. Now, lots of people ask me about her children. Who were her children? How many did she actually have? There were 10 in total. So I'll talk briefly through them now. So first, there is Charmaine West, who you may now remember. She was murdered in 1971. She was 8 years old. Just to remind you, she was not the biological child of either Fred or Rose. She was the biological child of Fred's first wife, Rena Costello, and the father was unknown. And as I mentioned to you, she came under the care of Fred and Rose West, and unbeknown to everybody, Fred had actually murdered her biological mother. Okay, so she came under the care of both Fred and Rose when she was murdered. Then we have Anne Marie West, who was born in 1964. She is still alive today. She was one of the main witnesses for the prosecution, and she described the most horrific emotional, physical and sexual abuse by Fred and Rose. She's actually written a book about the case. Just to explain who she was also, her biological mother was Rena Costello, the same biological mother as Charmaine West, but she was in fact Fred West's biological daughter. Then there's Heather, who was murdered in 1987 when she was 16 years old. She was actually the biological daughter of both Fred and Rose West. Then there's May, who was born in 1972. She's pictured here with a young Rose West as a baby. She actually wrote a book that was published in 2018, and that book very much focuses on her relationship with her mother, and she's published a lot of the letters that her mother wrote to her while in prison. And then there's Stephen, who was born in 1973. Now, the children are often categorised into two groups, the older ones and the younger ones. So the second group, the eldest of the second group is Tara, born in 1977. She's Rose's child. She was actually the biological child of one of Rose's clients during her sex work, seemingly at the request of Fred West himself. Then there was Louise, born in 1978, and you might remember me saying that Louise was the daughter who in 1992 reported that she was being physically and sexually abused by her parents. She'd reported it to a friend, it got through to social services, and then it got through to the police. And then there's Barry in 1980. And then finally, Rosemary and Luciana in 1982 and 1983. They were biological children of Rose, but they were fathered by the same client of Rose's. Okay, so that just gives you some familial context and a little bit of background about Rose West. Now what I'm going to do is to go back to the prosecution's case and how they constructed a case against Rose West. Now the victims, the 10 victims, can actually be categorised into two very distinct groups. The bodies of one group of the victims indicated a sexually motivated murder. The second group did not. So that caused some complications for the prosecution itself. So let's talk about the first group first and how the prosecution constructed a case. So the first group of victims relates to these 7 young women and girls pictured here that I've just told you about. The bodies of these 7 victims were found with gags, tapes and ligatures. It indicated a sexual assault and it indicated torture as well. Now the problem that the prosecution had is that Rose only admitted to having met Linda Gough, the first victim there pictured. It could not be proved categorically that she had met any of the other 6 victims pictured here. So that raises a really interesting question then. How did the prosecution construct a compelling case to the jury? That's a really difficult thing to do. If you're saying that she's only met one of those victims, that can be proven that she's met one of those victims, how do you go about proving or demonstrating a case beyond reasonable doubt that she was guilty of those murders? So what the prosecution did is they introduced something in court called similar fact evidence. Similar fact evidence relates to a previous conviction that the defendant has, and it's introduced to the trial, and it is strikingly similar to the crime. So it's a previous conviction that they have, and it is so similar to the crime that they're on trial for that the judge literally finds it impossible to disregard. So the prosecution asks, can we bring it in as evidence? And the judge has to decide. And in this case, the judge decided that it would be possible. Now, just to say, the use of similar fact evidence is very rare because of the safeguarding principle of the presumption of innocence. It's not something that is welcomed. You have to have a really good case to introduce similar fact evidence. And that's because similar fact evidence can be really prejudicial because of its suggestion that the defendant is most likely guilty based on something that they have done before. Regardless, similar fact evidence was introduced into Rose West's trial because they wanted to show that she had the propensity to commit the crimes that she was on trial for. Now, there were other cases used by the prosecution to show similar fact evidence, and I will talk about the young woman pictured here called Caroline Owens. Arguably in the literature, the case that was most similar was the strongest case for similar fact evidence. Now, Caroline Owens was a young woman. She was a previous lodger at 25 Cromwell Street. She had actually moved out of the property, and one day she was waiting at a bus stop. She was hitchhiking, seeing who came along. She says that Fred and Rose came along. She got into the car. They offered her a lift. She was taken back to 25 Cromwell Street, bundled into the house, she says, and raped and assaulted. Now, Fred and Rose did plead guilty to indecent assault and causing actual bodily harm, and they were fined £100. Now, in 1973, which was when they were convicted, that equates, £100 equates to about £1,286. Now, during her 1995 trial, Caroline Owens gave great detail during the testimony. She described the torture, which again I won't go into detail about, but described torture that really reflected the similarity that was apparent in the other victims' experiences, in that they were found with the tapes, gags and ligatures. But it wasn't that straightforward, because the defence undermined Caroline's testimony. They said she should have had very, very visible injuries to her face from what she had described. There were no visible injuries to her face. And in fact, the day after the alleged assault, she was seen by another lodger hoovering 25 Cromwell Street. Okay, she was taking out household duties. And the detail that she gave in 1973, some commentators have argued, is very different to the accounts that she gave in the 1995 trial. So the question then for the defence is, was Rose effectively on trial for previous behaviours? Now, similar fact evidence is criticised because it can be confusing and angering for jurors, and it can provoke that sense of and that desire for justice and punishment. Now, the defence argued that the jury could not weigh disputed evidence from living witnesses against inferred evidence from human remains, which is much more difficult to evaluate because it is silent. The defence argued that these were not facts that were similar. For the other three victims, the second group of victims, tapes, gags and ligatures weren't found on their bodies. So the prosecution needed to offer a different kind of motive as to why Rose would murder them. Now, the motive that was put forward by the prosecution is that these victims were nothing more than a problem to be resolved. So we will start with the first one, 8-year-old Charmaine West. Just to remind you, she's the stepdaughter of both Fred and Rose West. Now, can you see in that photograph there of Charmaine, her two front teeth, her adult teeth, have not yet descended. Now, when they recovered Charmaine's skull at 25 Midland Road, the previous residence of Fred and Rose, the skull showed the same thing, that her front teeth had not yet descended, just like in that photograph. And a dental examination for the prosecution argued that she could have died almost immediately. And if that was the case, Rose, of course, would be the obvious culprit, because Fred was in prison at that time, most definitely he was, for petty offences. But there was evidence categorically that she was alive, Charmaine West was alive, 6 weeks after the photograph was taken. And the dental examiner conceded that the murder could have been some 2 or 3 months after the photograph was taken. Each child is different in terms of the way that the teeth erupt through the gums and how long it takes. Believe it or not, there is no precise record of when Fred was released from prison back in 1971. But It was most certainly within 2 months of that photograph being taken. So the prosecution, to try to strengthen their circumstantial case, they relied on the testimony of a neighbour who claimed that this neighbour, she visited Rose when Fred was in prison and Charmaine wasn't there, inferring that because she wasn't there, she must have already been dead. Now, the prosecution did concede that they simply did not know how, when, or why Charmaine had died. Now, in a criminal trial, both the defence and the prosecution will present their evidence as a story rather than in isolated pieces of evidence. Because if evidence is presented as a story, it makes it more understandable, relatable. You can infer so much more from evidence that's presented as a story. And that's exactly what they did in this case. The story presented by the prosecution was that of Rose being a wicked stepmother who wanted to be rid of Charmaine, and in a fit of anger, she murdered her. But it's also important to bear in mind, as the prosecution said, that at the time of Charmaine's murder, Rose herself was only 17 years old. If we go to the next one, Shirley Robinson was 18 when she was murdered in 1978. Prosecution claimed that Rose murdered Shirley in a fit of jealous rage because she was pregnant with Fred West's child. She was 8 months pregnant. But the defence argued that Rose did not believe that Fred was the father, and she believed the story that he told, that he was covering for a respectable businessman who was the real father. And Fred himself actually told the police during the interviews that he needed to conceal from Rose that he was the father and that he was having this affair with with Shirley Robinson. And he said that Shirley threatened to tell Rose about the affair, and so he said she's got to go, and so he murdered her. And then finally, Heather. What to say about Heather, really? The prosecution argued that together with Fred, Rose murdered Heather. But the motive for Rose murdering Heather is entirely speculative. There really is no clear line of argument given by the prosecution as to what her motive was. If the prosecution can't give a compelling motive, that can sometimes cause the case to fail. As we've seen when Chris and I were writing the book, we've covered one case where we've seen exactly that happen. If you cannot offer a compelling motive as to why somebody would do something, that in itself can cause the case to fall. It obviously didn't in this case, but the prosecution theorised that an argument ensued between her and her parents, and together they murdered Heather. We do not know what that argument could have been about. It is entirely speculative. So when the evidence in a criminal case is weak or unclear, the research tells us that jurors may begin to rely on something that we call extra-legal factors. And those are factors that aren't related to the physical evidence in the case. They can't rely on the physical evidence, so they start to rely on other things, like the defendant's character. So as you can see, as I've briefly given you, the evidence in this case was debatable, it was unclear, and we will see now how the extra-legal factors like Rose West's character and credibility were perceived by courtroom observers and how that may have contributed to her conviction. Remember, I said that our goal is to look at why was Rose convicted in light of the debatable evidence. So it's crucial, the research tells us, for the defendant to appear as credible as they possibly can in what they say. Now, unusually, Rose took the stand. That's not very common for defendants to take the stand, but Rose West insisted that that is what she wanted to do. And it gave an opportunity for courtroom observers. So Rose's appearance and her demeanour in the courtroom became really important for judgments about her guilt or innocence. Her own solicitor, Leo Goatley, said that the demeanour of the accused can be absolutely critical, and that is what we will see in this case. That's a picture of her, by the way, on her way to court. So I just want you to think for a moment. This is something that I ask all of my students. Again, I won't ask you to shout out. It's against my teaching philosophy to ask people to do that. But just to think very quietly for a moment about someone that you met recently for the first time. You may or may not be able to do that. Somebody that you met recently for the first time. Just think to yourself for a moment. Did you quickly decide whether you liked or disliked that person? Don't use me as an example. What made you like or dislike that person? Was it something about their physical appearance that you liked or disliked? What did you notice about their social status? Did you judge them to be trustworthy or untrustworthy? And if so, how? We all do that. We all pull that face, by the way. Whether you like it or not, each and every one of you do all of these things because it is human nature. When we possess really little information about people, we have to rely on stereotypes. So we sum up people very, very quickly. Like it or not, we do it. So what I'm actually talking about here is something called credibility. If you're perceived as a credible person, it means that you have been received positively by another person. It means that what you say to another person is likely to be accepted as true and as valid. Now, your credibility is made up of all sorts of things. It's made up of things like your physical appearance. It's made up of your social status. We judge people on social status just by the things that they're wearing. How competent you appear and come across, and even how trustworthy you come across. So one of the things that helps you to appear credible is your physical appearance. So actually, like it or not, that can really be about how attractive you are. Or you can flip that and say how not odd you appear and how deviant you might appear. This is exactly what happened in the Rose West trial. Now, in this country, we're not allowed to interview jurors. We can't ask them what they thought about defendants in a case. So we have to rely on the courtroom journalists who observed the case and who wrote books about the case. And of course, in this particular case, we've got abundant material of what journalists wrote. So we turn to what the journalists said about Rose West. So for Rose West, the journalist said things like, she looks like a school matron. And they highlighted aspects of her unattractiveness, describing her as a plump, bespectacled woman. Another journalist said there was something very strange about the upper part of her face because of a ghostly darkness or shadow. What does that really mean? What he's really trying to say is that she didn't look very nice. It's as simple as that. She wasn't an attractive woman. She looked a bit odd. She looked deviant. And if you think that, not to be trusted. One of the things that can help you to appear credible is your social status, and there's some research out there that we certainly talked about in the book. Just in terms of how you dress, people quickly decide what your social status is simply by the way that you're dressed. So one of the journalists said about the Wests that they lacked detection for so long because of their low peasant cunning. Language is important, you know. Look at the word cunning. Cunning is a really, really negative word. It's got negative connotations. It's saying that despite their lowly status and that they weren't clever people, they were still somehow clever. They were described in the books that I read as immoral and uneducated characters. And the research that we reviewed showed that there is some evidence to indicate that defendants from a lower socio-economic background are more likely to be convicted than those of a high socio-economic background. So another thing that helps you to appear credible is your competence. So if you speak with competence, you're much likely to be perceived as somebody who is speaking the truth. Your message will be perceived as valid. So somebody who wrote a book about Rose and Fred West, Howard Soons, said that Rose made a silly blunder when incorrectly giving her age as 42 rather than 41. That's not something I would do, but... Another journalist said that she attempted to speak with competence when she said, "Sir, as I should like to emphasise." So just as a reminder, she took the stand. She was cross-examined. One of the journalists said that these were the phrases which would have seemed much more natural on the lips of a lawyer than a woman who is, among many other odd things, a bumpkin. That was how she was described. So what is Wilson, this journalist, saying about Rose? He's saying that a bumpkin, somebody who is as uneducated as Rose, doesn't possess the linguistic skills to use that kind of language. Another journalist said that she referred to counsel as sir and that it did not come across as a word she had used very often. They're all perceptions of how Rose came across, somebody who was wholly incompetent and uneducated and therefore could not be trusted. So if you come across as trustworthy, that will also increase your credibility. So do you think that Rose West would have come across as a trustworthy person? Definitely not. Because as I said before, now the similar fact evidence has been introduced to the case. So everybody knows about her previous conviction, and Anne-Marie, the eldest daughter, testified to the cruelty that she exhibited towards her children. There's another important point about why she was not perceived as trustworthy. And that is because the prosecution's theory, or the theme, if you like, the thing that formed really part of their story, was that she must have known. She must have known what was going on. The theme is that they were in it together. And whenever the prosecution spoke, that was what they talked about. This woman could not possibly have been married to this man and have all of that mayhem going on in the house and not have known. Just bear in mind that nobody else living in the house did know what was going on. Her own solicitor said that Rose was a seasoned whore, brazen and proficient in the art of lying and hoodwinking men. it would be remiss of me to fail to observe the misogynistic reporting of this woman, which, by the way, is in 2019. Goodwill. So if you come across as like a kind and friendly person, like you have a lot of goodwill, again, you will come across as believable and credible. The observers, the journalists, described Rose West when she was on the stand as a petty and spiteful character, that she showed a flash of anger, that she was defiant and stroppy, and that she could not disguise her belligerence very well. Now, just a point that we don't have access to the court transcripts of Rose West's trial. It's something that Chris Birkbeck, my colleague, and I have requested, and we've been granted access because we think it would be very interesting and very useful to examine the trial transcripts of Rose West actually on trial, to get some more information about what the journalists are observing here. So finally, dynamism. So if you have dynamism, that will increase your credibility. So what does that mean? If you've got dynamism, it means that you've got a lot of energy, enthusiasm, and boldness. Rose, in contrast, was described as matronly. They described her as walking with a managerial school matron sort of march, her right hand swinging mannishly. And again, it would be remiss of me to fail to observe some of the misogynistic reporting that was going on of her. Let's contrast that to another famous case. Or remember O.J. Simpson? How many of you are old enough to remember that case? So there's been lots written about the O.J. Simpson case, and he has been described as having a lot of charisma and the ability to command attention when he walked into the courtroom. He never took the stand in the criminal trial. He was found not guilty. He did take the stand in the civil trial where he was found responsible for or liable for the murders. But two very contrasting cases. We can relate the issue of credibility and believability to some other very famous trials of defendants and suspects. So let's just have a look at those for a moment. So O.J. Simpson, who I have just mentioned. This is someone who had very high credibility, very good looking at the time that he went on trial, very high social status. Did that perhaps contribute to his acquittal of double homicide in 1995? Stephen Avery, how many of you have watched Making a Murderer? Yes, we've got a few people. If you don't know about Making a Murderer, Netflix, you will literally lose 2 weeks of your life because you will be addicted to it. But Stephen Avery is central character, if you like, of Making a Murderer. Very low credibility, lots of disputes about his guilt and innocence, very low social status. Did that perhaps contribute to his conviction of homicide in 2007? You all know who Harold Shipman is. This is somebody who had very, very high credibility. He was a GP. Did that enable him to get away with murdering his patients for as long as he did? Jimmy Savile, incredibly high credibility at the height of his fame, a very trusted person. Did that enable him to get away with the prolific sexual offending for as long as he did? Does anyone remember Christopher Jeffries? Yeah, a very, very emotive case. For those of you who don't know, he's been subject to a drama series called The Lost Honour of Christopher Jeffries. It's well worth watching. I highly recommend it. He was suspected of murdering Joanna Yeats back in 2010. He came across as a bit odd, as a bit strange in the media. Did that contribute his low credibility to the media and the public becoming suspicious of him? Now, credibility of victims is also important. Whether they're aware of it or not, jurors, judges, the prosecution, defence lawyers, and everyone who follows a trial assess the credibility of all the witnesses who give evidence. It just is. Now, as well as looking at whether your appearance, your social status, your competence, etc., are indicators of your credibility or believability, the other thing that might be an indicator is your body language, your behavioural cues. So do you think you know when someone is lying to you? And how? What kinds of things do you look for? What are you suspicious of? One of the journalists said that they did not believe Rose's tears to be genuine because he described them as theatrical. She would produce a handkerchief and then weep ostentatiously as if she had taken out an onion and decided that she should appear vulnerable to the jury. Her body language, as well as her social status, as well as her competence, as well as her physical appearance, was not believed or accepted. So what do you think made her lies appear transparent, as Wilson suggests? And do you think you could detect a liar? So let's just see by a raise of hands. Do you think, according to the research, that liars decrease their eye contact? How many of you think yes? Yeah. People are like, oh, is this a trick question? It is a trick question because the research says no, they don't. What about, do liars raise the pitch of their voice? How many of you would say yes? You'd be right. They do. Do liars increase their body movements? How many of you would say yes? You're not expected to know, by the way. Okay, it's not a test, I promise you. You'd be surprised to know that the answer is no, they don't. Are liars less likely to be consistent in what they say? How many of you think yes? Yeah? No, they're not. Truth tellers are equally inconsistent. If you think about it, when you're recounting and recalling a story, you might actually find yourself saying, oh no, that's not actually what happened first. I went to the bedroom first before I went to the kitchen. I have found through all of the review of this research that there really is only one way to tell if somebody is lying. It's never let me down. That is the only way. But actually, there's a serious point to this because there is no way of telling. Because we have stereotypes, even police officers and prosecutors, about people, how people behave when they lie. So we think of things like fidgeting, covering their mouth, having a slouched position, lack of eye contact. But these behaviours actually are not indicators of lying. A paper actually reviewed over 200 studies, and they found that people are no more accurate at detecting lies than judgments made by pure chance. And that's the same for all types of people, whether you're a student or a police officer. The amount of times I've told this to my police officer colleagues, and I never get a rise out of them. Irritating. How many of you, again, familiar with Brendan Dassey, Making a Murderer? He was co-accused with his uncle, who I just showed a picture of, Stephen Avery. Brendan Dassey was 16 years old. Now, because of those inaccurate beliefs about indicators of deception, fidgeting, covering the mouth, slouched position, lack of eye contact, we see this in the case of Brendan Dassey. And these are officers interrogating him in the state of Wisconsin in the US. Those officers are trained in something called the read technique. And those officers look for behavioural cues that I've just talked about. Brendan Dassey, as you can see, has all of them. The slouched position, covering his face, lack of eye contact. But it is much more likely that that body language was reflective of someone who is young. He was 16 years old, and he had a speech and language functioning on the bottom percentile. Professor Aldert Ridge, who's based at Portsmouth University, is a prolific researcher in the area of behavioural cues of deception, and he argues that bodily movements and physiological responses is indicative of an individual's character, and therefore they are not reliable deception cues. We also need to be aware of the growing knowledge about neurodiversity and how that might impact on how somebody comes across to you in their body language. Okay, so in conclusion then, it's by no means the only explanation, credibility, but it has enabled us to analyse its potential contribution to Rose's conviction. We could, for instance, look at pre-trial publicity. That would equally be valid in trying to explain her conviction. Rose's credibilities were weakened by her courtroom demeanour and by her social characteristics. She had little education, and there was evidence of her sexual deviancy that came into the courtroom and the cruelty towards her children. Now, my objective here is to underline the contingent nature of Rose West's verdict, and the nature of that contingency is best illustrated by introducing a counterfactual, which refers to something that didn't happen in the case, but which might have done. For example, would the outcome of the trial be different if Rose West had not denied knowledge of the murders, but claimed that she was also a victim of abuse by Fred West? Let's take this one step further of other famous trials that we've covered in the book and ones that you will know about. J Simpson, acquitted of double homicide in 1995. Now, he spent $10 million on the dream team of lawyers who were incredibly skilled and persuasive in the courtroom. What if J Simpson had relied on a public defender rather than hiring an expensive legal team? Michael Jackson was acquitted of child molestation charges in 2005. Lots of disputes about his guilt and innocence. Unlike his own social status, the victim was from a family of disadvantage and lacked credibility. What if Michael Jackson's alleged victim belonged to a celebrity family? Brendan Dassey, the young vulnerable boy that I just showed you a picture of, convicted of homicide in 2007. He was a young boy with learning disabilities who was subject to hours and hours of interrogation with no lawyer present. He made an alleged false confession. What if Brendan Dassey had been assisted by a lawyer during his interviews with the police? Now, why is this knowledge of the research useful to you? It's useful because we can become aware of our own judgments and our prejudices, and we actually don't have to be legal practitioners for that to be beneficial. We are all involved in the construction of guilt and innocence of ourselves and other people every single day. Whether it be judging the guilt and innocence of someone during a work disciplinary, or indeed we might find ourselves in a position where we're constructing our own innocence when we feel that we're being judged. But it also happens during really informal encounters. For example, when you all have a fallout with your friends and your family, and perhaps it's time for us to become aware of our judgments and our stereotypes of people and question whether there is such thing as a true reality of being the one who is always right. And instead to ask yourself, are there actually multiple realities in your life at play. Thank you.